I have to start. It struck me actually during Joel's presentation to apply Heim's theory and acknowledge my own limits of knowledge, because I am not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. I am a custodian now of my late father-in-law's work. So it's truly a privilege for me to introduce him. And really, what I look at this as is an invitation to everybody in the back room, everybody that's watching that has an interest, to not only discover his extraordinary work, but to also perhaps get involved in helping all of us understand it a little more. For today, I'm going to really break this up into backstory, which I think is important for the context of the entire body of work. I'll go into some examples of what we found and the questions that began this entire journey. And then I want to dive a little bit into the man and his mind and sort of the legacy that I think, is potentially can come of all of this. And it really is what I say, is a true beginnings of a Cold War mystery. So to take you back, and I think something everybody can relate to is this idea of the first time you met your partner's parents, and having to tell them about yourself and your background and how you met. And ours culminated from a whole lot of crazy circumstances. As you see in that first slide, my experience in the Baltics, where ultimately Valeris was from it at one point, particularly Latvia. My career and exposure actually began in 2000 in Lithuania. I had left the U.S. Air Force. I medically retired as a staff sergeant in 1999. I spent a year in the oil and gas industry, doing corporate security, international corporate security work for a drilling company. And about a year after that was the first time I was contacted by a CIA contracting company that was run by a former case officer, or chief of station, actually, I should say, out of from Mexico. He had his own company and was doing contracting work. And at that time, again, 2000, we're about 9 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Lithuania was privatizing its oil and gas industry. The Lithuanian head of that industry, after the consortium was sold off to an American company, he, his son, and their driver were kidnapped, subsequently found beheaded in a shallow grave about a year later. But once that happened, then my job and task became to protect the Americans that were over there, to help secure the consortium and all the facilities, to sort of root out the influence of Russian organized crime throughout the system, corruption within the company, and all the while managing some of the more, let's say, geopolitical risks of Russia's and President Putin at that time, new President Putin, his interests in maintaining economic control, if not physical control, over the former Soviet Union countries. And so that I lived there for a few years, and following that was back and forth throughout my career, which spanned many companies and the rest of it. And fast forwarding to 2017, when I was there on some business and I was beginning to semi-retire and divest out of some consulting gigs, is when I met Natalia, who would become my wife. And Natalia, I met she was finishing her master's in IT engineering. I thought I would be impressive and invite her out to karaoke. And subsequently, I found out she was a professional opera singer and had been with the Latvian National Opera for 7 years at that point. And my friends had questioned, they said, are you sure she's legit? She's not a Russian spy, or a sparrow, as they'd call them. And to that end, I wound up actually buying her a T-shirt. It got asked so much that said, "Trust me, yes, I'm a Russian spy." But in a year or so, she obviously couldn't resist the charm. We were married, and by the end of 2018, immigrating to America, setting our lives up in Boston, just outside the Boston area, about 5 miles as the crow flies. And it was about November 2019 when we were moving, getting settled, and Nat was talking to her father, Valeris Chenahayev, who was living in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is where he was originally born, again, during the period of the Soviet Union. And she mentioned to him that our son had taken an interest in all things aerospace, airplanes, the STEM, and the rest of it. And he was just about 10 years old. And we were looking to get him involved in the Civil Air Patrol program. And Valeris very casually said, I'm going to send you some documents. I'm going to send you some things that I worked on in my career that maybe he'll find interesting when he gets over. And the holidays were coming. The life goes on as it does for all of us. Package received in the mail, DHL from Kazakhstan, and it sat on the kitchen table and collected mail and immigration paperwork and all the rest of it. And right before the holidays, or I should say right before Christmas, particularly, Nat got word that he had taken ill. Within days, his organs were failing. And right at Christmas or New Year's, right on New Year's Eve, she got word he had passed away and was already buried by the time she had even gotten to it. So all I knew about the man, probably like many of you about your in-laws to a degree or parents, is what you get from your partner, from your from the family, from the stories. What did I know about him? He was a once brilliant aerospace engineer. He was a diehard communist. I spoke with him 2-3 times over video. And we joked, particularly with my contrasting background to all things communist and Soviet Union. But he certainly longed for the return of it. But he was a troubled guy. He struggled with alcohol, and that is probably what killed him. He would have to be sort of tricked into wearing new clothes. If you bought anything, if anything new was bought for him, he'd refuse to wear it. So it'd have to be sort of dragged along the street for a little while, and then told that it was bought at a secondhand store. And he cared for his own elderly mother. So he was a complex character to say the least. And then something interesting happened weeks later. And again, we can reflect on what Greg was just talking about when it comes to consciousness or pure psychology. Nat had a dream about him, and when she woke up, she told me that in the dream he came to her, and he was young, well-dressed, looking good. And in the dream, he handed her a stack of papers, and he said, I can't help you with singing, but here. And so when I said to her, well, where's everything that he sent? So she collected it, and we sat down together on the couch, and this is the beginning of what we began to see. And Nat was fluent, always bilingual her entire life. And even as looking through these papers, it was obviously heavily scientific. It was complicated, complex. She didn't even have the language really to effectively translate it. If you can, I'm sure but many of you can't imagine, being in the sciences, trying to make a literal translation of theories and ideas is just very difficult. And so we were just grasping at straws, essentially, in trying to walk through and understand what we were looking at. And some of these papers that I'm bringing up here talk about things like the physical characteristics of artificial plasma or ball lightning. And this became an issue as we were going through the translations. Again, the literal translation versus a translation within the entire context. We landed on artificial plasma because it seemed to fit within the larger context of the body of work. But there are those who are Russian speakers who say no, it's talking about ball lightning. So again, I don't have a scientific background to differentiate in a broader sense what that may be. But a good example carrying on from that same discussion of plasma versus ball lightning. Somebody who has looked at these, who's become a friend since these have come out and have started diving into them, was asking about certain notations and saying, well, he has this number three here, and I don't understand. I said, well, it might not necessarily be a number three because it's written in Cyrillic. And we literally spent 1 hour talking about 10 characters and trying to decipher if those 10 characters were numbers as we would see them or were potentially uh, continuing on with the Cyrillic. And then these popped up. And that's what really grabbed the attention. Um, and as you can imagine, I'm sitting over my wife's shoulder and I'm, well, what does it say? What does it say? And it's a UFO. I said, well, does it say UFO? And she said, yes, it says UFO. It uses a term, the saucer, a sort of slang, let's say that's in the lexicon for saucer. These images in particular discuss the horizontal and vertical movement, the control systems, and the specifications of the manufacturing of the craft. They discuss what materials it is made of, and all the all the rest. We'll run through a few more of these. This one here I posted with the translation. You can read along with the illustration of the physical characteristics of the propulsion system. It goes into depth on the solenoids and how it achieves gravity, anti-gravity in many of that. And I think the important things is as we were looking at these and dissecting them, this did not seem like a casual interest. It was not kitchen table hobby. I sort of ran through this forensic psychology analysis. Is it something that he would perhaps sit around and instead of doing Sudoku, do theoretical physics of UFO? And the more we dove into them and subsequently since publishing and the more eyes we've had on them, they are painstakingly detailed. They are structured in such a way. The handwriting, we know Natalia has verified, not only is it consistent through the body of work, she recognizes it certainly as her father's. We had to put them into time frame. Looking at the typewriting put us into the 80s and early 90s, particularly in the former Soviet Union, and considering things about the advent and implementation of broader computerized systems and things like that. Some of the documents had obvious signs of aging, the yellowing of paper, probably as I like to imagine from the smoke-filled room as they were sitting in there looking at everything. And there were a lot of mentions not only of the past but of the future. And this again, why I found Greg's presentation just now fascinating when he talked about consciousness, because a lot of that is echoed later in the papers when he begins talking about how the craft operates and the interface with consciousness. And he takes the reader on a journey, or he is explaining how this interface with consciousness will develop in humankind and how it has developed. And what really caught our attention was he began talking about 2024 and things like the fall of the USA, um, which certainly, raised eyebrows and gave us a date and a motivation to work for. But the more we dug into it, we realized it wasn't about the fall in the sense of a collapse of an empire. It was really about a gateway and a significant change in resonance and consciousness that would, as he specified in there, affect 50% of society would move through this gate easily, and the rest would come along in the subsequent years beyond 2024. Um, but that again gave us this sense of urgency and time frame to really understand what it was. Even not so much if there was some catastrophic disclosure in there, to save the world, but really on this idea of, well, if nothing else, we know he hasn't touched these papers since 2019, and 2024, it was right around the corner. We were about halfway through 2020 at that point. So it gave us a little bit of an opportunity to say, well, how legit is this stuff? And that's what we've spent the 4 years doing, going through these documents like this one here that's up now, that again goes deeper into propulsion, that goes into thermonuclear fusion, and touches on the how the craft is powered, how it operates, how it fuels itself, so to speak. And those next 4 years were made all the harder because we had no help. We had this really a mystery on our hands. We are right here, as I said, outside the Boston area. I reached out to every university that had an astrophysicist department willing to buy breakfast or a cup of coffee, to a Russian speaking physicist who could just take a look at these things and just tell us, is it, as I say, is it the ramblings of a madman? Is it something valid to the academic discourse? Is it just a nice family heirloom that everything in it has been disproven and might have been relevant back in the 80s or so for whatever reason? And it was a matter of, it's the more silence there was, the more quote unquote rejection there was, the more I questioned, well, why isn't, and we were sending screenshots and of the scans and the rest of it. I reached out to everybody who was popular in the ufology circles. As I said, not only am I not a scientist, not only am I not a physicist, I'm not particularly a huge UFO/alien fan. The limit of my experience was binge watching Ancient Aliens, over a weekend, if anything. And we had two major developments. First of all, was a friend of ours, who was actually did a little bit of work with the European Space Agency, researcher, academic named Robert E. Snyder. He's over in Switzerland. And our friend Mario Fialo, who's credited as a co-contributor, co-author on the translation of the body and work, who is a enterprise systems architect who toyed around a lot with AI, and he had actually built his own AI system, his own AI assistant, I should say. And so he expanded it to include helping assist us with the translations, to at least speed the process. And so essentially the process began. We ran the AI assisted translation. Nat would check it for grammar, linguistics. We would do things like focus on the words, because the words became very important. I think the choice of words. None of this was presented as theory. It was presented as observations. Now, caveat, it never said, oh, I was looking at this UFO and this. It said, but it specified, in a way that made that from the reading, you would conclude it was an observation. It was very factual, detailed, including some precise measurements and all the rest of it. And ultimately, I started drafting this body of work to present it publicly, to put it out there. Sort of took to the consciousness and the resonance idea, let's say, and said, well, if I, I'll put it out there and let what happens, let the universe take it where it will, so to speak. And through that process of the translation, of trying to validate the documents themselves, because again, the question became, what was the purpose? Who was this for? I like to describe the body as having observations, measurements, using physics to explain the to explain the observations, and then a little bit of narrative in detail as though he is explaining to somebody else. Because again, contextually, these were never meant for publication. He did not write this as a book and send it and say, "Oh, you're living in the U.S. now. Can you, get this out there?" I believe his dedication to the USSR, was certainly had come into play, if that was ever a thought in his mind, and not having that ability to ask him any of those questions, um, made us research and go even deeper. And sitting down with Natalia several times, or on long drives between her gigs, we're back and forth to New York all the time. So, it gives us 8 hours during the course of the trip both ways to talk about it and memories and try and have that framework and correlate that framework of the time period that he was of that he was in and where he was, and we'll break that down a little bit more. But we've discovered so much about the man, and I believe this is a truly groundbreaking body of work. I think it is ultimately the final frontier when we talk about disclosure, and I'll touch on that in a minute. What we've done and compared it to that has led us to that conclusion. And again, what others have said, our friend Robert Eastniger had said, it's like having the Rosetta Stone for advanced and exotic sciences and UFO propulsion. But again, that's why it's out there now, and that is for the community like this to decide and to dive into. So let's touch for a few minutes, talk about the man. Valeris Chenohayev. Sorry, my wife is Chenohayeva. The name is, particularly the first name in Russian, would be Valery. This is Valeris, who's Latvianized. Born 1958 in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. The city he was born in is down on the Caspian Sea. At the time, it was known for being the epicenter of both the Kazakh oil industry as well as Kazakh military and engineering studies. Uh, the family has a history in that field. There are family members in Russia who have backgrounds in nuclear sciences, some of whom from the Cold War days have still never left Russia and can't leave Russia. He trained in Riga, Latvia in the 1970s. Um, the Riga Aviation Academy that he studied at was certainly a prestigious institution under the Soviet Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was formerly the military, a military aerospace school. Then they had the civilian branch of it. And again, contextually, time frame, history wise, the idea of being a young Soviet citizen from a satellite republic, and the government is ups and moves you to another republic or another satellite nation to attend university, signifies again both academic achievement, loyalty to the party, and all of those things. When I asked Nat, or when we talk about, well, what did he, when you were a kid, what did he do? What did you think that he did? She recalls him being away for long periods of time, back and forth to Kazakhstan, talk of working in the space program there as well. And those behaviors match this Setka program, which was started within the Soviet Academy of Arts and Sciences institutions. And so he's the right man in the right place at the right time. The Setka program was essentially split up in two areas. One was a military branch, one was a civilian branch. It was known to recruit and or use students right out of the universities. And there were other, key indicators that have sort of come up over time. Um, Distance from friends. He had a very small class. We're not talking about hundreds of people in a class. We're talking tens, 12, 15 people in the class, with whom he broke off contact. He didn't live in the dormitories. He lived in a private apartment. All indicators, again, of special treatment in a system that was meant to make everybody equal. Aside from these papers, we found no other documentation, no other releases. I would imagine one of the things that pops into the scientific mind is about peer review. Again, within the Soviet Union, peer review wasn't necessarily a thing. You did your work, you forwarded it to a supervisor, that supervisor would put his name on it, and it would continue to go up the chain of authority, chain of command. And you didn't look for recognition or acknowledgement. Your work was for the good of Mother Russia, for the good of the Soviet Union. So to seek or desire personal recognition was certainly frowned upon. And so, in that sense, I don't know if there was a formal peer review process in those. What we did find, one of the interesting things was a patent from the 1990s. In particularly, it was filed in 1990 and ultimately approved in 1994. The credited author of the patent was a very high level Soviet politician. He was sort of an interim between Gorbachev and Yeltsin as all that transpired. And again, my thinking from my background in geopolitics was that there perhaps was a concern that whether it was just these sets of papers or these papers were part of a larger body of work around this reverse engineering type activity, that the new Russian government sought to legally protect themselves, legally secure their intellectual property that still might have been bouncing around in Kazakhstan, which was now in between former Soviet nation and newly independent nation, and all the rest of it. And so that again has very close correlations, echoes, similarities, though it doesn't go into the degree of depth that Valeris's core works go into. It certainly reflects and as I say, echoes a lot of that work that is in there. So it seems it would have been Valeris's work would have been an iteration of an early draft of what became this patent. And the patent, again, frankly, just looks like a giant UFO. And again, he passed in 2019 in Kazakhstan. We've not had the opportunity to travel there. We're gently trying to work with other extended family members to see if he has other belongings, other papers, whether or not directly related to that. It would be still nice to have and nice to take a look at and understand what was going on there. Again, I covered a lot of this already, but I'll just touch on it once more. Is once brilliant, later broken. Story I think many people can relate to, if not in themselves and in another family member. They had this privilege, this idea of a man existing without a country. Again, to have this sort of brilliance and to be working on a program, seemingly again reverse engineering a UFO that would have taken up the majority of his, if not his academic career into his professional career, and then everything you believe in goes away overnight, essentially. That you've dedicated your life to working inside of this type of program, this type of secrecy. You are between countries. You have to choose where you're going to belong next as countries, become independent. um where do you go? What do you do? What do you tell a new employer you were working on? And particularly, even through today, in many of the Baltic countries, particularly Latvia, to call it out and be honest with you, having a Russian surname um, excludes you from many, many opportunities, because they just still look at people of Russian ethnicity and origin, um, as as the oppressors, and in their own ways, they will try to make them pay. And that's why I feel for them. I talk about this idea with veterans, particularly people who live in this type of life, in this type of world, needing to have a mission. And when that mission was stripped away, what did he do? He looks like he drank himself to death over the end of it. As I said, there was no other records we were able to find specific to him. We can certainly correlate institutions, places, others who are public figures in the history of Soviet UFO investigation. Um, One of the more interesting things that came out after publishing the book, or that happened after publishing the book, was I was contacted by a somebody out of Texas, a retired law enforcement officer who had taken up ufology in investigation in his retirement, and he was working on a book specifically to talk about the technology of UFO and bring together all the theories. And he was very excited to find this body of work. He said he hadn't seen anything else like it. Nothing is detailed, nothing with the math and the physics behind it. And his research had led him to believe it was actually the craft that's described in Valeris's papers was actually the same craft that is often associated with Russia's Area 51 Kapustin Yar. Um, and he sent along a bunch of photos with that, and he was very excited. But was interesting about it to me was we had reached the same conclusion prior, a few months prior, in trying to do this forensics examination. um, I wanted to research known alleged Soviet era UFO recovered crashes, and there was a drawing that was actually featured in a History Channel documentary about Kapustin Yar, and ran that drawing against the schematics from Valeris's paper, and the output essentially said one looks like it's from memory, Valeris's looks like it is from observation and very detailed. I look at this body of work now as a roadmap, and talking about the patent. We've got the Russian patent, the US Navy patent for the triangular craft. There's a Chinese patent. There's about six altogether that we've identified so far. That again, the science matches. Science matches. Some of the drawings align too. Um, Whistleblower testimony. Bob Lazar's uh, statements, drawings, testimony, all of these things align with what things we find in the book, which explains them. So again, I go back to Robert Eastenegger's comment about the Rosetta Stone. That's how we've been using this, and how we've really began to try and investigate what value is there in this. And it hit me one night at about 2 a.m. I woke up, and thought to myself, what if all the questions that are being asked, what if the answers are out there already? Because there's so much being asked, particularly of the government, and I'll focus and pick on the UAP caucus and those hearings. But it got me thinking, when an inquiry is made and it's about a UFO or a UAP, they sort of have a protocol to chase that down. So I thought to myself, well, what if we don't ask about them? We just ask about the science. And from the book, I extracted 52 scientific topics. And out of those 52 topics, I picked the top ones that was sort of seemed most aligned with existing research that was going on. And I sent out four Foyer requests actually, and it was so this was late Saturday into Sunday morning. So at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, I was sitting outside having a cigar and sending off electronic Foyer requests. That again, I used a GPT to help me format them and structure the question in the right way as to not raise any flags. So those went out Sunday. On Tuesday, I had two responses. The first one was from NASA, who said, "You don't have a properly formatted request and we are closing this." And the second was from the US Navy. And the officer replying copied in four additional people and just said, "Do you want the easily releasable things?" I forget the exact specific term, but it was essentially, "You want the easy releasable things or you want everything we're going to have to research for too?" And I said, "I'll take the easy stuff and see what I get and then make a decision if I want to go any deeper into it." And haven't heard back from him yet either, but I found it interesting that within one business day, I had two rapid replies to a Foyer request. But then I went a step further and said, well, what if it is all out there already and we're just asking the wrong questions? And as you can see, if you've been reading the slide as I was talking, we found an 85 to 95% match across the number I have. There's 54. That number's up to over 70 agencies now that are tied directly to the science. That 15.2 billion between 96 and 2002. Again, if you have followed it all, that is now up to basically 150 billion annually across all of these projects. Because the initial research I did was focused on 1980 to 2000, which, to go back to Valeris's notes, is my assessment of the time frame in which they were written. So the question became, what publicly available data is there? Whether research from a government agency, a government contractor, some other institution associated with the government, declassified documents, and limited it to that time frame. And expanding that out a little bit more for the statistics fans out there, those 52 scientific areas also included things like consciousness studies. And while the results of that came back to some of the more popularized declassified programs like Stargate and some of the remote viewing exercises and things like that, when you incorporated all of those metaphysical aspects that perhaps mainstream science doesn't necessarily accept, but are common within the UFO industry. If you consider many of those types of programs are possibly still under a classified umbrella, then our rate of correlation was still at 76%. And why is that relevant? Well, we've gone to war and people have gone to jail on less certainty. President Obama approved the operation to enter Pakistan by the Navy SEALs against Osama bin Laden on intelligence that was 60% confidence. President Bush invaded Iraq on 30% confidence. And again, federal cases are brought against people on a lot less information. I did a little number, was trying to put a number to, how much Al Capone was accused of, and ultimately he only went to jail for tax evasion. So I say that because that framework of whether you want to include the metaphysical aspects of 76% matching government programs, or purely scientific research that is aligned at 85 to 95% correlation and matching, again, leads me to question, we have this body of work. We know from it, we have high confidence, as they'd say in the intelligence world, that it was associated to the reverse engineering of a UFO and subsequent programs developed in Russia. Even today, when Russia talks about their space-based weapon systems, they talk about using new physical principles for EMP systems and so forth. So if we know they were basing it off of reverse engineering a UFO, then where did the US come up with the idea? Where did all of these institutions come up with these ideas? And how are they going to, and why do they exist in the format they exist in? And that's why I say I think when it comes to disclosure, they will never, whether it's Arrow or the UAP caucus, they will never find that UFO smoking gun, because it is so compartmentalized and so buried in the science. And that is by design. That is the purpose, to prevent that kind of quote unquote radical disclosure. And so this body of work becomes a roadmap for the public, for investigators, to chase down those end users of the research, of the products that were developed around this technology. So again, to touch on Greg's presentation on consciousness, again, I find that another one of those universal factors: right place, right time, right subjects, back to back. I appreciate the opportunity to share this story. Um, you know, intentionally wanted to keep it a little bit short, because I'd love to really open it up to more questions and more discussions, particularly with the folks backstage. But this is, important to the legacy. The purpose of this, we have made this available publicly. So this is not just that it's a book, go buy it. If you go to the website, engineeringinfinitybook.com, there is a PDF flip viewer, and all 294 pages of it are open to view and explore. There is an option to buy a download. There's an option to buy a hard copy for anyone who wants to mark it all up and do that. But this is what was dropped in our laps, and I think we've done all we can really do with it. And we need folks like everybody here, everybody who is watching, to not only take an interest in it for the historical significance, I think, of the body of work, um, but are there tidbits in there that unlock potentials for the betterment of humankind? I think there's so much focus on this idea of national security and the secrecy around the UAP UFO question that we've forgotten, and what we've learned from our understanding of the book, that the technologies that are in here have much broader applications to everyday life, in energy and healthcare and transportation, and all of those things that I'm sure so many of you are interested in and involved in. And that's why we said, when we put this out there, we've got to translate it, and we have to make it available for anybody to look at. We want to be, we call for disclosure and transparency. We have to lead by example and be transparent and provide our own disclosure of what we have. And so again, I want to thank you all for listening. Tim, that is this is going, oh, there we go. It's not just a legacy, it's a wave. And resonance, again, if you believe in that in consciousness, you are here hearing this today because you might be able to be part of the solution.